WBAI commentator for many years, is a fellow of the Transnational Institute in Amsterdam, and she directs the New Internationalism Project at the Institute for Policy Studies, and thank goodness there is an Institute for Policy Studies, otherwise K Street would be more of a desert than it is. She's helped to found and remains on the steering committee of the U.S. Campaign to End Israeli Occupation, a group with which Brooklyn for Peace is affiliated. She works closely with United for Peace and Justice, the anti-war coalition with which we are also affiliated. She co-chairs the UN-based International Coordinating Network on Palestine. She's played an active role in the peace movement for many years, far more than is listed in her biography. And she continues to serve as an advisor to several top UN officials on Mideast and democratization issues. She's really a wonderful analyst, and I hope you will give her your rapt attention.
What was I saying? I was in Iowa. So I was in Des Moines, and I was in Ames, and a few other places talking about the usual stuff. But one of the events I did, which was in Ames at the university, was for some, special lecture series, and the title that they gave it was The Arab Spring, How Can We Help? And I thought, well, that's kind of an interesting notion, because I think they were thinking of it in the context of what can the U.S. do? What would be the U.S. policy that would be the most useful? Me, I wasn't thinking about it so much that way. I was thinking about what can we do? We people, ordinary people, citizens, civil society, all of that. But it made me think about that, and I realized that the first answer to that very crucial question, what can we do to help, is end the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, stop our government from militarizing and preventing the Arab Spring from moving forward, and stop U.S. support for the Israeli occupation and apartheid. That seemed pretty easy. It was like, okay, now can I go home, But we're talking now at a moment of, it's a rather extraordinary moment. We have a huge victory to claim as our own. It's an incomplete victory, but it's still enormous. And that is the announcement of the withdrawal of troops from Iraq. That is our collective victory. This is not something the Obama administration wanted. Despite all the election stuff about, I will end the war in Iraq, and oh yeah, by the way, I will escalate the war in Afghanistan. That's the promise he kept, yes. But there was a lot of claimed interest in ending the war in Iraq, but at the same time, the military was having none of it. The military's line was, we got to stay. We got things to do. We're not done here. So, okay, they had a lot to do, and a lot of what they had to do involved what militaries always do, killing people and breaking things, right? So, in that context, the fact that President Obama listened to us, the people, who now in the 75% or so range have been saying, get out of Iraq now, that this is not a war worth fighting, is a real victory. Now, we didn't do this victory alone. The victory belongs to the global peace movement, the U.S. movement, and especially to the people of Iraq, who have been so incredibly clear about not wanting the continuation of the U.S. occupation. Some of that opposition obviously took a military form. A lot of it took a non-military form. But it was strong enough that the U.S.-backed, corrupt, weak government in Baghdad didn't have a whole lot of choice. He knew he could not get public support, so he didn't try to keep the troops there. Ironically, this is a situation where both the U.S. president and the Iraqi prime minister, they really want to keep U.S. troops there. They both have an interest in it. But the people in both countries, oops, not so much. So the problem they faced was, how do we do what we want when our people don't want us to? On both sides. So they both are saying, we must end this war, right? But for the moment, let's just keep a few troops here. Maliki, of course, wants U.S. troops because it's not at all clear that his government will survive without those troops. Now, I'm not convinced that would be the worst thing in the world. His government is nothing to write home about. But it is kind of where the dependency lies. He couldn't even get the support of his parliament, let alone the people, to support what would be necessary to keep the U.S. troops. The U.S. wants to keep the troops for the military reasons, but they couldn't do that unless they get the Iraqis to agree to something called immunity, right? Iraq was having none of that because they knew what the U.S. troops did with immunity over the last 8 years, and it wasn't a very pretty sight. Immunity means if the U.S. troops are there, they're not accountable to Iraq, to the Iraqi justice system. They're not accountable to Iraqi civilians. They can do whatever they want to Iraqis. They can kill, maim, rape, torture, as they've done for 8 years, and they wouldn't be held accountable. So the U.S. position was, without immunity, we're not staying. And the Iraqi position was, well, we really want you to stay. Can't you kind of reconsider? We can kind of fudge it. Nope, we want immunity. After all, we had immunity for 8 years. We're not giving it up now. That's what they couldn't agree on. So guess what? The agreement that George Bush was forced into signing with Iraq back in November of 2008, in his last months in office, is actually going to be implemented. That's huge. That's a huge victory. Now, let's talk about why it's not an all-sided, comprehensive victory. Because even if they abide by the letter of that agreement, the SOFA it's called, the Status of Forces Agreement, and pull out all the troops by the end of this year, there's about a little less than 40,000 left, and all the Pentagon-paid mercenaries, Pentagon-paid contractors, that's about 70 to 100,000 at any given moment. Even if they did all of that, there's a little glitch in the language of the SOFA that says we have to withdraw all the troops and all the Pentagon-paid contractors, but it doesn't say anything about contractors paid by somebody else, like the State Department, for instance. So what do we see going on at the State Department? A massive, quick move to sign a bunch of contracts so that all these contractors can stay in Iraq, do the same thing they're doing, rape, pillage, mayhem, whatever, but they won't be paid by the Pentagon, so it won't be a violation. How's that for good lawyers? So we need to keep the pressure on to pull all of them out. We're building, as you all know, the biggest embassy in the history of the world. It's going to have 5,000 people. Of those 5,000 people, more than 4,000 are there for security. There will be 16,000 at least, that's the number we're hearing about, State Department paid contractors to provide security and more. So it's not quite an end to the war. But I think we do need to claim it as our own, as a victory, that the best they're going to be able to come up with by their standards, wanting the war and the occupation to continue as is, the best they can do is to have a few thousand State Department contractors running around the country. That's a pretty good victory. It's not complete, but it's a pretty good victory for us. I'll get to questions after, okay? There's been no public discussion of the question of impunity or immunity for the contractors. The contractors in the past did not have immunity legally. They had no guarantees of immunity. They had U.S. protection, which in most cases meant that they were simply not ever turned over to Iraqi authorities. But there was no agreement between the U.S. and Iraq to provide that immunity. So it was a matter of the U.S. not turning them over. There were a few instances where they were turned over to Iraqi courts, but very, very few. It's one of the big questions, whether they will be able to recruit and keep enough contractors in the country to do these various jobs when they can't promise immunity, and they can't promise that there'll be anybody there from the U.S. to represent them. So it's a bit of a conundrum for them. Kind of cool. I mean, in an abstract way. People in Egypt are very concerned about the role of the military right now. Right? And that's a huge problem. I think it's a much greater problem for them. Part of the problem of the Egyptian military has been from the moment the Arab Spring erupted there, that the military is torn between two competing interests. On the one hand, for the first time, they don't have a dictator that shapes their loyalty to the nation. They need to have some kind of popular support. That means doing what they did, which was refusing to come out against them in the street. That was very important. On the other hand, the military still gets $1.3 billion a year in military aid, which doesn't go to the government of Egypt. It goes to the military directly. And so the discordance of that relationship was, we've got to do what people want. We can't just go against people's interests anymore the way we always did in the past. But we don't want to piss off the Americans, pardon my French. That's kind of the fear. We depend on that money. Right now, I think that's one of the reasons that the election in Tunisia was so important. That it did not involve the military. The military stayed out of it altogether, provided a model for how that can work. But the role of the military in Egypt is a huge challenge. I'm not as worried about Lieberman and McCain meeting with them as much as I am with their meetings at the Pentagon. You know, who's actually leading the Pentagon. Now, that's a huge problem. But it's one that the people in Egypt are going to have to deal with. Pakistan is a mess. There's a huge divide between the military, the civilian government, and the intelligence agencies of various sorts. And they have very different economic and political and military interests. The U.S. has an interest historically in the intelligence agencies. That's who tells us who to kill. We depend on them. Now, there's absolutely no reason in the world we should depend on them, given their propensity to use those positions for their own interests, as every country does. The notion that our so-called kill and capture list is based on who the ISI in Pakistan puts on that list is rather, I mean, shameful. Does that even begin to, you know, cover how outrageous that is? But it's a huge challenge. The government in Pakistan is very weak and has very little popular support. The military is very strong, but also doesn't have popular support. The ISI is strong and has no support. So it's a really messy scene. There is a vibrant civil society in Pakistan. Pakistan is not a country like Afghanistan, where there's, you know, the poverty is so profound that there is no social infrastructure. There is both a physical and a social infrastructure in Pakistan. But it is a very troubling and troubled relationship. The U.S. right now is essentially staking out red lines and saying, if you don't, then we will. If you don't go after the Haqqani network, for instance, along the Afghan border, we will go after them. And the Pakistani government says, you can't do that. We're a sovereign, you know, a sovereign government. The U.S. answer is the equivalent, the diplomatic equivalent of watch us. You know, you don't do it, we will. And that's, you know, one of the issues about how international law is playing out. The U.S. position is we can do whatever we want, wherever we want, against whomever we want, for as long as we want, and you've got nothing to say about it. Because we are the biggest, baddest, toughest country in the world, and we were attacked on September 11th. Don't forget. Never forget. So that's a huge problem. That's a huge problem. How it's going to play out is anybody's guess at this point. I don't think the Pakistanis know. I can be pretty sure that people in Washington don't know. All we know is that they're escalating the drone strikes, these targeted assassinations, which is what they should be called, something that even George Bush criticized Israel for carrying out. The U.S. is now doing this with impunity and immunity, and without anybody knowing about it, with complete deniability because they're carried out by the CIA instead of the military, by these guys that are based in a Nevada base where they can sit at their computer consoles using their joysticks to kill people by video screen and be home in time for dinner and 9 rounds of golf.
And that was what the kids are practicing.
Exactly. And the kids will play video games so they know how to do that. And everybody will cheer because there's no U.S. casualties. And the cost of Pakistanis, well, they're not here. They don't vote. We don't care. I don't think there's any evidence that the Islamists have taken control of anything. Islamists in Tunisia have won, apparently, a plurality of the election. In Egypt... Sorry?
They're very moderate.
They're what the U.S. likes to define as moderate. I don't know that that's a word they use. They define themselves as a mildly Islamic party. So, yeah, their model is Turkey. I got to say, I was in Turkey for the elections in June. It was pretty impressive. Among other things, they have voter turnout of like 87%. We are thrilled when we get, what, 40? You know? So they have a lot to teach us. Now, the U.S. is worried about a lot of things. Islamist influence in any country they don't like because they make racist, Islamophobic assumptions about what that means vis-a-vis democracy, by their definitions, etc. I'm not so concerned about what the U.S. is worried about. I'm more worried about what people in Egypt want and what they get, what people in Tunisia want and what they get, what people in these other countries want and what they get. So far, it seems that the various Islamist parties, and there's dozens of them in each of these countries, there's lots of different parties, some secular, some religious, are very, they're very popular. These were parties that were largely suppressed under the U.S.-backed forced dictatorships, and they have emerged with significant showings, significant power. The party, the Ennaha, I don't think I'm pronouncing it right, but it's something like that, in Tunisia, that seems to have won the plurality, has said explicitly that they see Turkey as the kind of model they would like to emulate. I don't know that any of, I mean, your first question, I think, is the fundamental one. how likely is it that the Arab Spring is going to lead to democracies in the Arab world? Certainly we don't know yet. It's way too early. I think that what is likely is that Arab democracies that do exist, that do emerge from this process, from these revolutionary processes, will not look like our democracy. Hopefully it won't be as flawed as our democracy, but it will also look very different, I think. It will, for one thing, not celebrate secularism the way we do. Now, to me, that's not such a great thing. I'm a pretty secular girl, and I'm not happy about religious elements of any sort having power anywhere. But I don't live there. You know, I'm a Jewish girl from California. I don't get to say who is ruling in Egypt, for instance, or Tunisia. So, you know, I think it's a question of, do people in Egypt think that this is a free and fair election? Certainly seems so. I mean, sorry, in Tunisia. When elections are finally going to happen in Egypt, and that's a really big problem because of the military, whether they're going to allow the elections. I think the military right now is a bigger threat to Egyptian democracy in the future than any Islamist forces are. That's going to be a question. Do the people of Egypt feel like it's representing their interests and what they want? It probably won't be much like a government I would like to live under, but I don't live there. So it's, you know, we have to be very careful about not assuming that what we see or what our government sees as dangerous is seen as dangerous for the people who choose it. The role of the pro-Israel lobbies, and there are several, there's the traditional, largely Jewish lobby groups like AIPAC, the Council of Presidents, the others that work primarily within the Democratic Party and have more influence in Congress, and there's the newer Christian Zionist organizations that tend to have more influence in the Republican Party and more influence or aim more at the White House. So there's a set of lobbies. They're very powerful. They've come to power in an era where the strategic ties between the U.S. and Israel were dominant. Particularly after 1967, when you had the Pentagon looking at the Six-Day War and saying, wow, these guys are good. The mythology was they had trumped 6 Arab armies. Now, in fact, they didn't. There were only 3 that fought. But that was the mythology. And it was in that context that the Pentagon essentially said, we could do business with these people. And they began to do lots of business. So that first it was a move towards the integration and intersection of the military producers in both countries that began to work together. And in that context, the Pentagon itself began to work very closely with the Israel Defense Forces. At the same time, this other trajectory, the lobbies that had been around for dozens of years before that but had never had much influence, began to grow in their influence because suddenly they were on the same side as this strategic trajectory. So it's like if you push a train that's already moving in one direction, you can then stand back and say, wow, I'm really powerful. I pushed that train the way I wanted it to go. The fact that it was already heading in that direction doesn't have to come into the conversation. So the Israel lobby for a long time portrayed itself as far more powerful than it actually was. With the end of the Cold War, because during the Cold War, of course, Israel emerged strategically as a very important cat's paw of U.S. imperialism around the world, certainly in the region, but also as far afield as Mozambique and El Salvador and Chile and South Africa and Angola and Guatemala, et cetera, Israeli trainers, Israeli weapons, became part of U.S. Cold War strategy. With the end of the Cold War, suddenly Israel was looking like maybe it was not such a strategic ally anymore, and with the effort to put together an Arab coalition to go against Iraq in 1990 and 91, Israel was looking positively like a strategic liability. Not surprisingly, that was the one period when you saw significant pressure from the White House against Israeli settlements, because their strategic value had completely diminished. The lobby power had not diminished, because by that time they had become so intersected that who was the dog and who was the tail was really a kind of silly debate, because it was the interconnection that was important. After 9/11, the strategic value reemerged. The lobby, once again, has a strategic connection, so that's what emerges. My disagreement with the Walt Mearsheimer thesis is twofold. One is that I think they define the lobby in a way that I think is less useful. The other, and I'm not going to just get into all the details, but the other is more on the question of how they see the assessment between the power of the lobby and the strategic power. There's a different assessment there. So.
Yeah, you mentioned that the change in discourse in the general population on Israel-Palestine has not been reflected in the change of discourse among our policymakers. What do we do about that?
Yeah, it's one more question, not one more lecture. What we do about that is we join the U.S. campaign to end the Israeli occupation, which Brooklyn for Peace already has, yay. We work on challenging U.S. military aid to Israel. And the best way to do that these days, you know, it was always hard before 2008 to make an economic argument about military aid to Israel. The amount hasn't really changed. It's been about $3 billion a year, about, you know, the largest amount of U.S. military aid, of any aid to any country anywhere in the world, for years. But in the overall scheme of things, $3 billion when you're talking about the U.S. budget is chump change. I mean, unfortunately, sad but true. So talking about it as, you know, we can't afford that was kind of a hard argument to make. Now we're talking about $30 billion. Granted, it's over 10 years, but $30 billion is not chump change. $30 billion is a lot of money, even in Washington. So that's the basis when you look at, for example, aid to Israel. It's giving you a 10-year thing because that was the agreement that was signed by the Bush administration in which President Obama immediately agreed to implement. $30 billion of your tax money. Really? We can afford that for the 23rd wealthiest country in the world? I mean, it's appalling. So it's a question of, do we want to save our communities or support Israeli violations of international law? That's the trade-off. So that's the first thing, is to stop that. The other is to challenge these diplomatic efforts to provide immunity to Israel in the United Nations. So this thing with the vote after the Palestinian statehood bid is only one part of it. The veto of the settlement. I mean, the veto of the settlement resolution should have been, and I think was, in fact, really embarrassing for the U.S. This was a resolution that was so namby-pamby weak that most Palestinians didn't really support it because it didn't go anywhere. It was drafted deliberately to use U.S. language. You know, the U.S. always says we're against settlements. Settlements are an obstacle to peace. Once, back in the day, they used to say they were illegal. They don't really say that much anymore, although they haven't changed the legal opinion. But so the question of what do you say, you know, when you're talking about the veto, means that there's no way to justify it. There's just not a way to justify it. The reality of what that veto was they were vetoing what they say should happen. Washington vetoed what it calls for. And when you ask them, how could you do this? The answer is, well, it was the wrong venue. It's like whining. It's like 5-year-olds whining. I don't want a green lollipop. I want a red lollipop. I don't want to have no more Israeli settlements in the UN. I want to have no more U.S. settlements in the Quartet. Really? That was really the essence of it. So we have to be the ones to call that out and say, this is bogus. This isn't about strategic interests. You know, the answer was always, this is not going to create a Palestinian state. Damn straight it's not. That's a big problem. But the notion that the U.S. is preventing other countries, because, you know, they were threatening other countries with cutting off all aid to those countries that voted in favor of the no settlements resolution. It's really unbelievable. I mean, talk about being the 800-pound gorilla in the room and throwing your weight around. This is like insane. So military aid, stopping the diplomatic support, and this is where we have to keep up with members of Congress. Members of Congress have moved far, not way far enough, but little bits and pieces of things on Iraq and Afghanistan. On Israel-Palestine, not so much, as you all know. Brooklyn is, you know.
Not at all.
Thank you, but it never means that you're allowed to not talk to them anymore. You're not allowed to do that. You can't do it as peace activists. You just can't. You go there knowing you're going to be slapped down, and they've got to know that you're not going to go away. That they can slap you down as much as they want, and you're coming back for more. That's just the way it is. You don't want to hear it, Dov Hikind or whoever you are that replaced him, fine. But we're here. We live here. This is our community. We pay your salary. Sit down and listen. And the reality is, they often will have staff who are really, eager and willing to engage. So don't get the meetings with them necessarily. Deal with getting the staff, because the discourse within offices in Washington, that all plays a role too. The issue of human rights is at the core of what we're doing. If we want to talk about women in Afghanistan, it's not enough to say the Taliban were terrible to women. Yes, of course they were and are. The Northern Alliance warlords were and are terrible to women, and they're the ones in the government. Women die in huge numbers in Afghanistan too early and too young. Not because the Taliban kill them, they die in childbirth. Because you know the number of where Afghanistan is on the UN figures of which country is the worst country in the world for a woman to live through childbirth? Afghanistan's number one. It's the worst country in the world. That was in 2000 when the Taliban were running Afghanistan. You know where it is today? Same place. Children in Afghanistan have improved a lot. They used to be the worst. It was the worst place for a child to be born and survive to her 1st or 5th birthday. You know where they are today? Number 2. Sierra Leone got worse. That's what 10 years of U.S. occupation of Afghanistan brings us. So when we hear about, well, we have to stay because what would happen to the women, remind them of that little soundbite. Thank you.